Hello, so today's session is about advanced communication. And by the end of the session, you should be able to explain transactional analysis's three ego states and recognise how these can relate to interactions. So we are going to be looking at transactional analysis, and this was a theory developed by Eric Berne, and it relates to verbal communication. And Berne believed that verbal communication, particularly face-to-face communication, is at the heart of social relationships. And he developed a theory for analysing human behaviour and communication. He believed that people could change, with the assumption being that people are responsible and have the capacity to change their lives, but can be prevented from doing so by leftover failings of early childhood patterns. So it does have some elements of psychoanalytic, humanist and cognitive approaches. Berne was influenced by Freud particularly, and specifically the idea that the human personality is multifaceted. We'll think a little bit more about what that means in terms of the approach. But next I wanted to start to consider this idea of transaction. In the theory, Berne viewed a transaction as the fundamental unit of social intercourse. And he said that if two or more people encounter each other, sooner or later one of them will speak, or give some other indication of acknowledging the presence of the other or others. This is called a transactional stimulus. Okay. Another person will then say or do something which is in some way related to the transactional stimulus, and that is called the transactional response. So this idea of focusing in on the interaction between people was the focus of Berne's work. There are other ideas that you will pick up if you read about Berne. So according to Berne, people can engage in psychological games which represent unconscious ways of gaining recognition, or strokes. So Berne relates this as strokes, that by using repetitive patterns of interaction, people will try and gain strokes or recognition. Berne was very interested in understanding sequences of interactions, and he termed these as games people play, and that was the title of his seminal book. And he also talked about there were patterns of relating that can occur across a whole life, which become life scripts. Sometimes these life scripts can be helpful and functional, but sometimes they can be problematic and can result in people experiencing some kind of issue within their life and their relationships. This theory has been used widely in counselling, in books about communication generally. So it's widely used when you read texts about team working, group work, management, leadership, those sorts of things as well. So quite a widely used approach. Obviously we'll just be touching the surface today, but certainly it's an approach that I found very, very helpful in informing my practice. So we're now going to go on to look at the core idea of Berne's work, which is the idea of ego states. And Berne defined an ego state as a consistent pattern of feeling and experience directly related to a corresponding consistent pattern of behaviour. So Byrne identified 3 ego states, which I'll go on to describe, and he says that these can be observed, and he really developed this idea out of his therapeutic relationship with clients, where he noticed that the people that he worked with would respond differently at different times, and some of this was based on historical experiences. So he started to develop his understanding of people responding, this kind of multifaceted part of human personality, that people would transact with other people, interact with other people in different ways at different times, and he defined that as being related to their ego state. So we'll pick that up, and I'm going to go through the ego states next. So the first of Byrne's ego states is called the parent ego state, and Byrne describes this as being a collection of recordings of external events experienced or perceived in the early years of a child's life. So he approximates this to about the first 5 years of life. Now, the majority of external events are actions of the parent, but actually it can be anyone. So here it states it's influenced by authority figures from early life, mainly parents or carers. But these events are recorded without question or analysis or interpretation. You might have recordings of things like never talk to strangers, for example. That would be a message that's been recorded. So it serves to retain both the positive and negative messages spoken and modelled by parental figures during childhood. So there is a tendency within us to nurture and discipline others that is often located within this parent ego state. So it is past facing, and when an individual responds from this state, or begins an interaction from this state, they will be unconsciously replaying the tone and or content of these messages that they recorded from their early childhood. So you might be able to recognize times where you say something, so you say something unconsciously, but then you might actually become conscious that, oh my goodness, that is exactly what my mom used to say to me, or something. Certainly I've experienced that. So that's the parent ego state. The next one is the child ego state. So quite often this is described as a felt concept, but what it represents is the recording of the internal events associated with the events the child perceives during those first stages of life. So again, thinking about approximately up to the age of 5, the emotions or feelings that accompany those external events. So the parent ego state records the external event as it is, and the child ego state is the recording the emotion or feeling that accompanies those events. So the child ego state is a kind of repository of all of those childhood experiences, both positive and negative. Interpretations of the self are those formed during childhood. So it can involve kind of infantile feelings such as insecurity, but also playfulness. So that's the child ego state. So again, it's past facing, it's how you reacted then. So it's very much an emotional, instinctive, non-analytical way of interacting. And that can mean that when you're coming from this state, thinking can be slightly muddled, and our decision-making ability can sink to a very low level if we're responding from a child ego state. And the final ego state is the adult ego state. So this is an ego state, which is a learned concept. It's very rational. It's very much located in the here and now, and this is thoughts, feelings, and behaviour that's based upon an analysis of your own personal experiences. So the adult allows the young person to evaluate and validate child and parental data. So it really comes out of a child's ability to see what is different than what they either observed or felt. It's where somebody is starting to, come from their very own place rather than coming from something that's very, very strongly influenced by those people in early life or your experiences in early life. So it allows somebody an individual to start to evaluate and validate the data that they get during childhood and adulthood. So it assesses inner and outer realities and uses knowledge and experience to interpret and respond appropriately to current situations. It's a more logical place and objective outlook on life. So that's the adult ego state. So there are these three ego states that Byrne identified, and you will see them represented as three circles: parent on top, adult in the middle, and child at the bottom. So this summarises that the parent ego state are behaviours, thoughts and feelings copied from parents or parental figures unconsciously, and the adult ego state are behaviours, thoughts and feelings which are direct responses to the here and now, and the child ego state are behaviours, thoughts and feelings replayed from childhood. So those are the three ego states. So from a transactional analysis perspective, a psychologically healthy person will have access to and express all of these ego states in appropriate situations. So, there are situations where a child ego state is completely appropriate. I regularly come from a child ego state when I'm playing with my little boy, for example, when I want to be playful, curious, enthusiastic, silly, then I can come from that child ego state. But that often in terms of professional relationships, the ideal scenario is communication from adult to adult ego state, and we'll think about that a little bit more. But I just wanted to add another layer of complexity onto this, because I like to make it complicated, but there was further development of the theory in that the parent and the child ego state were separated into two. So you had nurturing parent and controlling, or sometimes called critical parent. So they are broadly seen as being that the critical parent is more negative and the nurturing parent is more positive, but they both can have elements of both. And really what you want is you want the messages that you've had in that early childhood to be nurturing in terms of being caring, encouraging, sympathetic, concerned, protective, but with some structure in terms of some boundaries, so you have got the positive of the more critical side as well. But the controlling or critical parent is quite often experienced as judgmental, disparaging, demanding, condescending, patronising, angry or blaming. So that's the negative side of the more dominant critical parent experience that some children have. But there is also potential negatives for too much nurturing parent in terms of childhood, that there may not have been structuring boundaries, and that level of nurturing could spill over into spoiling type of messages. So this just kind of gave a little bit more context for understanding what was going on for people when they were coming from these two ego states. And then similarly, in terms of the child ego state, there were these two sides. So the adapted child, so adapted children tend to be very cooperative, which is seen as being and compliant, which is seen as being a positive trait. But on the more negative side, there can be resistance, resentfulness, complaining, helplessness, reluctance, fearfulness, and feelings of inferiority. So there is that element to adapted child, and you can see that sometimes there is a link between, so if we're thinking about the child's external experience, between that critical or controlling parent, if that is very dominant, then you maybe are more likely to have an internal experience of cooperating but developing levels of resistance. So when I think about this, I think about some of those more passive aggressive types of behaviours that people can experience. And on the other side is the free or natural child, which is open, trusting, spontaneous, curious, playful, creative, intuitive and enthusiastic. So that's on the positive side, but there can be that kind of immaturity or spoilt experience from the free child side as well. So sometimes people perceive, that free child is all positive and nurturing parent is all positive, but we have to be mindful that there needs to be a little bit of balance there. So that's just giving a little bit more. So I guess what I'm going to urge you all to start thinking about is your own experiences, and this is not about criticizing those that were around us in our early years, but just thinking about what we heard and what messages that might have been that we took on about ourselves, and what that means when we respond from our parent or our child ego state. So Byrne identified two types of transactions. So this is how people interact, referring to the three ego states. So what we have here are two structural diagrams, parent, adult and child, and this represents two people in an interaction. So the first type of interaction is a complementary transaction. And this is seen as the most simple and healthy interaction, is if somebody offers a transaction stimulus, so begins an encounter from their adult ego state to the person they're interacting with's adult ego state, and they respond back likewise. However, another complementary transaction would be if the transaction stimulus comes from someone's child ego state to the other person's parent. So, for example, Paul's had a very stressful day at work, comes in and says to his partner Steve, "I'm really bad at my job, I can't cope anymore." And Steve responds, "Oh Paul, but you're great at your job. Maybe I could do the cooking instead of you tonight." So it's complementary in that Paul responds from his child ego state to the parental ego state of Steve, and Steve responds back from his parent ego state to Paul's child. So it's complementary, there's no conflict, and so in some respects it could be seen as healthy. Although if we look at that from a perspective of a kind of empowering practice, it may not be seen as the most empowering of transactions. So the other type of transaction that Byrne identified was called a crossed transaction. So this is when a transactional stimulus comes from one ego state. So for example, someone communicates from their adult ego state to somebody else's adult ego state, but the response might come back from a different ego state. So here's an example. Somebody comes home and says to their wife, "Do you know where my cufflinks are?" So that's an adult to adult interaction. But the response that they get from their wife is, "Oh, why can't you ever look after anything properly?" So that appears to be a response from the wife's parent ego state to the husband's child ego state. And that's where it might be that there is some form of conflict that comes out of that transaction. So it might be that the husband then responds as a child, maybe adapted child, maybe stomps off and sulks, for example, or might respond from their a critical parent ego state as well. So cross transactions are more likely to lead to conflict within the interaction than complementary transactions are, and are seen as being potentially unhealthy. So that gives you a kind of quick whistle-stop tour of transactional analysis. Here are the references for the session today, and we can think a little bit more about how it applies or how it might apply to social work practice when we meet.